I thought losing my name on that document would break me, but it was the sentence that came next that changed everything. Margaret Whitmore is not listed as a beneficiary. The attorney's voice was calm, almost rehearsed, echoing softly against the polished wood walls of the probate conference room in downtown Columbus, Ohio. For a moment, I wondered if I had misheard him. My father's will. His estate. The house on Maple Ridge Road where I learned to ride a bicycle. The small manufacturing business he built from a rented garage in 1978. My name was not listed. I kept my hands folded in my lap, the same way I had folded them beside my father's hospital bed during those last 6 winters. Outside the tall windows, February snow clung to the sidewalks, and I could see my breath faintly when the door opened and closed. Inside it felt even colder. My son Daniel shifted in his seat beside his wife, Ashley. She wore a cream wool coat and a smile so faint most people would have missed it. I didn't. For 8 years after my mother passed, I was the one who drove the 42 miles round trip every Tuesday to take my father to his cardiology appointments. I was the one who refilled his prescriptions, balanced his checkbook when his hands began to tremble, and learned how to reset the breaker when the old furnace tripped in the middle of January. At 2 in the morning when he called because he couldn't remember which pill was for blood pressure and which was for cholesterol, it was my number he dialed. I never kept score. He was my father. Love doesn't send invoices. So when the attorney cleared his throat and began listing the beneficiaries, I listened carefully. Daniel Whitmore. A percentage of company shares. A college fund for each grandchild. A donation to First Lutheran Church. The lake property to be sold and divided. Each sentence landed like a small deliberate tap against glass. Precise. Legal. Final. Still my name did not come. I felt every pair of eyes flick toward me without fully turning their heads. The air smelled faintly of leather and printer ink. I straightened my spine, refusing to let my shoulders fold inward. If humiliation was what this was meant to be, I would not give it the satisfaction of spectacle. 2 years ago, Daniel had offered to help Grandpa organize his finances. Seemed reasonable at the time. Online banking can be confusing at 89. Ashley had gently suggested that updating the will might also be wise, just to keep everything streamlined and fair. I remember standing in my father's kitchen, the smell of black coffee rising between us, when he told me they were meeting with an attorney. Just housekeeping, he'd said. I trusted him. I trusted all of them. The attorney reached the final page and closed the folder with a soft click. That concludes the primary distribution, he said. The word primary echoed in my mind, though I kept my expression neutral. Daniel exhaled slowly, almost as if he had been holding his breath. Ashley's fingers tightened around the handle of her handbag. I could feel the weight of absence pressing against my chest, heavier than any winter coat. I was 67 years old, a retired school librarian, a widow of 12 years. I had buried a husband, held my father's hand through hospice, and balanced a household budget on less than $50,000 a year. I had learned that dignity is a choice you make when the room expects you to crumble. So I sat there composed while the truth hung between us. On paper I was no one. And yet beneath the stillness a quiet instinct stirred. My father had been many things, stubborn, frugal, proud, but he was never careless. As the attorney placed his palm on a second, thinner envelope resting apart from the main file, I noticed the slight hesitation in his eyes. In that pause, in that single suspended breath before he spoke again, I felt something shift. The story was not over. Not yet. The attorney did not open the envelope right away. He ran his thumb slowly along the sealed edge as if confirming the name written across the front. Margaret Whitmore. My full name, written in my father's unmistakable handwriting, steady and deliberate. For a brief second I was no longer sitting in that conference room. I was standing in my father's kitchen 3 summers ago. Sunlight pouring through the lace curtains while he insisted on making pancakes even though his hands trembled when he held the spatula. He had always been precise. Even when age softened his posture and slowed his steps, his mind remained sharp, observant, quietly strategic. The attorney looked up. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, addressing me directly for the first time that morning. Your father left specific instructions that this be presented to you after the primary will was read in full. I felt Daniel shift again beside Ashley. The subtle confidence that had settled around them minutes earlier began to thin. Ashley's expression did not change, but her jaw tightened just enough for me to notice. I kept my hand steady. "You may open it," the attorney continued. The paper made a soft tearing sound as I broke the seal. Inside was a letter folded neatly around a second document printed on heavy stock paper. I recognized my father's voice immediately, even before I began reading silently to myself. "Margaret, if you are hearing the first part of this without your name included, then everything has unfolded exactly as I expected." My heart did not race. It settled. There was no bitterness in his words, only clarity. He explained that 2 years earlier, after the discussion about updating the will, he began to feel pressured to simplify matters in ways that did not reflect his true intentions. He wrote that while he loved all of us, he knew who had been present not only for holidays and photographs, but for the ordinary Tuesdays and the long nights when breathing felt like work. The second document was not a revision to the will. It was a fully executed living trust, established 18 months before his passing, legally separate from the probate process. The attorney leaned forward slightly. "This trust transfers ownership of the Maple Ridge property and 51% of Whitmore Tool and Die to you, effective immediately upon his death." 51%. Not half. Not a shared slice. Controlling interest. A quiet but decisive majority. Daniel inhaled sharply. The sound was small, but in that room it carried weight. Ashley finally turned her head fully toward me, confusion replacing certainty. The attorney continued explaining that assets held within the trust were not subject to the same distribution outlined in the will. They had already been retitled. The paperwork had been filed properly. There was no oversight, no clerical error. My father had divided his legacy in 2 separate tracks, one visible and one protected. I read the last lines of his letter slowly. "I needed you protected from pressure," he wrote. "I needed you to have the authority to make decisions without having to ask permission. Do not argue. Do not defend yourself. Simply stand firm." I folded the letter carefully, smoothing the crease with my palm. Across the table, the narrative had shifted so completely it felt almost tangible. Minutes earlier, I had been the forgotten daughter. Now, without raising my voice or lifting my chin any higher than before, I held the majority of the company my father built from a single rented garage nearly 5 decades ago. The snow outside continued to fall, steady and indifferent. Inside that room, however, the temperature had changed. Not because of money, not because of property, but because the truth, patiently prepared, had finally been placed in my hands. I did not look at Daniel right away. Instead, I thanked the attorney for the clarification, my voice steady, the way it used to be when I read storybooks aloud to a room full of restless third graders. Calm tones changed the temperature of a room more effectively than raised ones ever could. The attorney nodded and began outlining the next steps, explaining that as trustee and majority shareholder, I would need to schedule a formal meeting with the company accountant within 30 days. He spoke about fiduciary responsibility, voting rights, and operational authority. Each phrase settled over the table like a quiet recalibration of gravity. Daniel finally cleared his throat. "There must be some mistake," he said, attempting a polite smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Dad would have mentioned something like this." I turned toward him then, not sharply, not dramatically, just enough to meet his gaze. "Your grandfather mentioned many things," I replied evenly. "Some conversations are private." Ashley shifted in her chair, crossing her legs carefully. "We were only trying to help him simplify," she said, her tone measured but tight. I studied her face, remembering the afternoon she had brought over color-coded folders, and suggested that I step back from managing my father's appointments because it was becoming a lot for someone my age. I had smiled then too. Age has a way of being used as both compliment and dismissal, depending on who is speaking. The attorney confirmed once more that the trust had been drafted by a separate estate planning specialist in Cincinnati and executed in the presence of 2 independent witnesses. It had been funded properly. Titles had been transferred. The controlling shares were no longer part of the probate estate. In simple terms, the decision had already been made long before this morning. Daniel leaned back, absorbing the information. The confidence he carried into the room had dissolved into calculation. Owning 49% of a company sounds substantial until you realize you cannot outvote the remaining 51. I felt no surge of triumph. What I felt instead was recognition. My father had known the dynamics unfolding around him. He had seen who arrived early and who arrived when paperwork was involved. He had listened more than he spoke. For years, I believed I was protecting him from stress. In truth, he had been protecting me from pressure. The attorney asked if I had any questions regarding immediate decisions about the Maple Ridge property. The house sat on 3 acres, with a detached workshop and a view of the small lake my father loved. Daniel had once suggested selling it quickly to free up liquidity. I answered calmly that no sale would be considered until I completed a full review of company operations and property evaluations. There would be no rush decisions. No urgency manufactured by anyone else's expectations. The meeting began to wind down. Papers were stacked. Pens were clipped back into suit pockets. The ordinary sounds of closure returned to the room. Yet nothing about the balance of power was ordinary anymore. As we stood, Ashley offered a restrained congratulations, the word careful and controlled. I nodded politely. "Thank you," I said. "There will be a shareholders meeting next month. Notices will be sent formally." It was not a threat. It was procedure. Outside, the snow had begun to lighten, the sky shifting from steel gray to a softer winter blue. I stepped into the cold air and inhaled deeply. For years I believed devotion meant endurance. That love meant staying quiet when overlooked. But as I walked toward my car, keys steady in my hand, I understood something with absolute clarity. My father had not left me an apology. He had left me authority. And authority, when carried with composure, does not need to announce itself. It simply stands. The drive home felt longer than 40 minutes, though the highway signs insisted otherwise. I kept both hands steady on the steering wheel, the letter resting in my purse on the passenger seat as if it carried its own quiet pulse. Snow lined the shoulders of Interstate 70 in uneven ridges, and the late afternoon light reflected off the frozen fields like sheets of pale glass. My phone rang once before I reached the county line. Daniel's name appeared on the dashboard screen. I let it ring through to voicemail. Authority does not rush to answer confusion. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the modest brick ranch I had lived in since my husband passed 12 years ago looked unchanged, almost indifferent to the shift that had taken place that morning. I unlocked the front door, set my purse on the kitchen table, and carefully unfolded my father's letter again. I read it this time out loud softly, letting each sentence land without interruption. He had written about stewardship, about patience, about how a business survives only when someone values the people inside it more than the numbers on a spreadsheet. He mentioned the machinists by name, men who had worked beside him for over 30 years. He wrote that leadership is proven in ordinary weeks, not dramatic moments. I realized then that the trust was not simply protection from being overlooked. It was an assignment. The following morning I called the company accountant, Mr. Peterson, and scheduled a meeting for the next week. My voice did not waver when I introduced myself as majority shareholder. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, then a respectful acknowledgement. Word travels quickly in a business that employs fewer than 50 people. By noon Daniel called again. This time I answered. "We should talk," he said, the confidence from earlier replaced with something closer to urgency. I agreed to meet at the Maple Ridge house that Saturday. Neutral ground. When Saturday arrived, the sky was clear and painfully bright against the snow-covered lawn. I arrived 10 minutes early and walked through the familiar front door with my own key. The air carried the faint scent of old pine and motor oil from the detached workshop. Daniel and Ashley entered shortly after, their footsteps careful on the hardwood floors. We sat at the dining room table where my father had balanced invoices for decades. Daniel began explaining projections, expansion ideas, and the importance of unified decision-making. Ashley spoke about modernization, branding, and restructuring leadership roles. I listened without interrupting. When they finished, I placed my father's letter on the table between us. "This company will not be rushed into growth that compromises its foundation," I said evenly. "There will be a full audit. We will review contracts, supplier agreements, and employee retention. After that, we will discuss direction." Ashley's expression tightened slightly. Daniel leaned back, measuring my resolve. I did not raise my voice. I did not reference percentages. I did not need to. The authority my father transferred was already recorded in ink and law. We only wanted what was best, Daniel said quietly. I held his gaze, not with accusation but with clarity. Then we are aligned, I replied. Because what is best requires transparency and patience. Silence settled over the table, not hostile but recalibrated. Outside, the frozen lake shimmered beneath the winter sun, steady and unbothered by the shifting currents beneath its surface. For the first time since the reading, I felt something deeper than vindication. I felt grounded. My father had not set a trap. He had set a boundary. And standing within it, I understood that the true inheritance was not control over assets. It was the confidence to lead without apology and without fear. The shareholders' meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at 9 in the morning, in the same modest conference room my father had used for decades, with its long oak table scarred by years of blueprints and coffee cups. I arrived 20 minutes early, carrying a leather folder that held the audit summary Mr. Peterson and I had completed over the past week. I had spent hours reviewing balance sheets, supplier contracts, payroll records, and equipment depreciation schedules. Numbers tell stories when you are patient enough to listen. By the time Daniel and Ashley walked in, along with the operations manager and 2 senior machinists who held minority shares, I already understood more about the company's current condition than anyone expected me to. Daniel began with a polished presentation about expansion into neighboring states, referencing projected revenue increases and potential tax incentives. Ashley spoke about rebranding the company image, suggesting a new logo and a marketing consultant based in Chicago. They were prepared. What they did not anticipate was that I would be equally prepared. When it was my turn to speak, I did not criticize their ambition. I acknowledged it. Growth is not the enemy of stability, I said calmly. But timing determines whether growth strengthens a foundation or cracks it. I opened the audit summary and reviewed 3 specific concerns. A recent increase in supplier costs that had reduced margins by 4%, an aging milling machine that would require a $120,000 replacement within 18 months, and a dip in employee retention over the past year. I watched as the room shifted from assumption to attention. The operations manager nodded slowly. The machinists exchanged brief glances that carried quiet approval. Authority is rarely about volume. It is about preparation. Daniel attempted to redirect the conversation toward long-term scaling, but I held the floor gently, not by force but by focus. I proposed a 12-month stabilization plan. Renegotiate supplier contracts, allocate capital for equipment upgrades, and implement a retention bonus for employees who had served more than 10 years. The cost analysis was already calculated. The timeline was realistic. The risk was measured. Silence followed, not resistant but contemplative. Ashley finally spoke, her tone measured. She asked whether delaying expansion might cause us to lose competitive advantage. I answered evenly that competitive advantage begins with operational excellence, not external appearance. The vote was formal. As majority shareholder, my vote determined the outcome, but I did not rush to use it. I asked each member to speak openly. When the ballots were counted, the stabilization plan carried unanimous support. Daniel leaned back in his chair, absorbing the result. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, only a recalibration of influence. After the meeting adjourned, the 2 machinists approached me privately. One of them, who had worked beside my father since 1985, said quietly, "Your dad would have approved." That single sentence carried more weight than any financial projection. As I walked through the production floor before leaving, I noticed details I had overlooked in the past. The rhythm of calibrated machines, the careful precision of hands shaping metal, the pride embedded in routine. This was not just an asset. It was legacy measured in decades of steady work. When I stepped back outside into the crisp Ohio air, I felt no triumph over Daniel or Ashley. What I felt instead was alignment. The company was no longer drifting between urgency and impression. It was anchored again. My father had entrusted me not with control for its own sake, but with stewardship. And stewardship, I was learning, is exercised not in dramatic gestures, but in deliberate decisions made when everyone else expects you to hesitate. The weeks that followed did not explode into confrontation the way some people might expect. Instead, they settled into a new rhythm, one shaped by structure rather than assumption. I began spending 3 mornings a week at Whitmore Tool and Die, arriving at 8:30 with a thermos of coffee and a yellow legal pad. I reviewed vendor proposals, met with department leads, and listened far more than I spoke. Authority, I was learning, becomes sustainable only when it is visible in action. Daniel adjusted to the shift in quiet stages. At first, he attempted to present every operational idea as a collaborative suggestion, carefully measured, as though recalibrating how he addressed me. I responded with the same calm tone I had always used as his mother, but with the clarity of a majority shareholder. Our conversations became less about persuasion and more about data. When he proposed a new distribution partnership in Indiana, I asked for cost analysis, logistics projections, and risk assessment. Not to dismiss him, but to ground the idea in evidence. Ashley, however, struggled more openly with the change. During one afternoon visit to the office, she stopped by my desk holding a draft of the proposed branding redesign. The new logo was sleek and modern, replacing the traditional script my father had chosen in 1982. "This is the future," she said, her voice controlled but firm. I studied the design carefully. It was not poorly done. It was simply disconnected from the story the company carried. "The future does not erase the past," I replied evenly. "It builds on it." I suggested integrating elements of the original design into the update, rather than discarding it entirely. She nodded, but I could see that what unsettled her was not the design itself. It was the fact that approval no longer flowed automatically through her influence. At home in the quiet of my kitchen, I often reread my father's letter. Not because I doubted my position, but because it reminded me why restraint mattered. He had not entrusted me with control to create division. He had entrusted me with responsibility to create stability. One evening, Daniel came by alone. He stood in my living room, hands in his coat pockets, the confidence he once carried replaced by something more reflective. "I thought you would step back," he admitted quietly. "You always let Grandpa handle everything." I considered his words carefully. "I supported him," I said. "There is a difference." He sat down across from me, the distance between us smaller than it had been in weeks. "Did you know?" he asked. I shook my head. "I trusted him," I answered, "the same way he eventually trusted me." That night after he left, I realized something important. The shift was not only legal or financial. It was generational. For years, Daniel had seen me as steady but secondary, present but peripheral. Now he was learning to see me as decisive. The company continued stabilizing under the 12-month plan. Supplier negotiations reduced costs by 3% within the first quarter. The aging milling machine was ordered with a structured payment plan that preserved cash flow. Employee morale improved when retention bonuses were formally announced. Progress did not make headlines. It created consistency. And consistency, I discovered, has its own quiet power. I no longer felt the need to prove anything at every meeting. The documents spoke. The numbers aligned. The leadership was visible. My father's decision had not divided the family beyond repair. It had clarified roles that had been blurred for too long. Standing in the factory one afternoon, listening to the steady hum of calibrated machines, I understood that legacy is not about who speaks the loudest at a table. It is about who remains steady when the room grows quiet and uncertain. And in that steadiness I had finally found my place. Spring arrived quietly in Columbus, and with it came a steadiness I had not felt in years. The snow along the edges of the factory parking lot melted into shallow puddles, and the morning air carried the faint scent of thawing earth instead of winter steel. 3 months had passed since the trust shifted everything, and Whitmore Tool and Die was no longer operating in uncertainty. The stabilization plan was producing measurable results. Supplier contracts had been renegotiated with more favorable terms. The new milling machine had been installed without disrupting workflow, and employee retention numbers were the strongest they had been in 5 years. What surprised me most was not the improvement itself, but the atmosphere. Conversations on the production floor felt lighter. There was less speculation, fewer whispered assumptions about ownership or direction. Clarity has a way of calming even those who are not directly involved in decisions. Daniel began arriving earlier, often before I did. I noticed him walking the floor with the operations manager, listening more than he spoke. One morning he stepped into my office holding a printed report. "You were right about pacing expansion," he said, not reluctantly but honestly. "We would have stretched too thin." I looked at him carefully, measuring the sincerity behind the words. "Timing matters," I replied gently. "Ambition is not wrong. It just needs foundation." Our conversations no longer felt like negotiations. They felt like collaboration. Ashley remained composed, but the edge that once sharpened her tone had softened. She presented a revised branding proposal that integrated the original script logo into a modern layout, preserving the history while signaling growth. This time, when she placed the draft on my desk, there was no challenge in her posture, only professionalism. I approved the concept after minor adjustments, and for the first time since the will reading, she smiled without calculation. The true turning point, however, came during the quarterly employee luncheon held in the warehouse break area. Folding tables were lined with catered trays of barbecue, coleslaw, and cornbread. I stood beside Daniel as he addressed the team, outlining the company's progress and thanking them for their commitment. Then he did something unexpected. He invited me to speak. I walked to the front without notes. I did not discuss percentages or projections. I spoke about my father's first rented garage, about how he believed that steady hands and honest work outlast trends. I thanked them for trusting new leadership during uncertain months. When I finished, the applause was not thunderous. It was genuine. Later that afternoon, Daniel approached me near the loading dock where sunlight filtered through high windows. "I misjudged you," he said quietly. There was no defensiveness left in his voice, only reflection. I considered the weight of those words. "You underestimated experience," I answered, not unkindly. "That is common." He nodded once, accepting it. Driving home that evening, I realized the inheritance had evolved beyond legal authority. It had reshaped perception. I was no longer the quiet widow who handled paperwork in the background. I was visible, decisive, and respected. Not because I demanded it, but because I demonstrated it. My father's letter remained folded. In my purse, its paper slightly softened from being read so often. I no longer needed to revisit it for reassurance. Its purpose had already been fulfilled. He had seen what others overlooked. And through his foresight, he had not only secured my position, he had restored balance within a family that had mistaken patience for weakness. As the sun set over the Ohio fields, casting long golden lines across the road ahead, I understood that legacy is not defined by who receives recognition first. It is defined by who carries responsibility with composure when recognition finally arrives. By early summer, the maple trees lining Maple Ridge Road were thick with green leaves, and the lake behind my father's house reflected the sky like polished glass. I had begun spending Sunday afternoons there, not to make decisions, but to sit quietly on the wooden dock he built with his own hands 30 years ago. The board still creaked in familiar places. The air carried the scent of water and cut grass, and for the first time since the reading of the will, I allowed myself to simply be his daughter again rather than his successor. The company continued moving steadily under the stabilization plan. Revenue had increased modestly not because of expansion but because of efficiency. Employee turnover had slowed to nearly zero. The new milling machine was running smoothly, and the updated logo, now blending the original script with a cleaner design, had been rolled out without erasing the company's history. Daniel and I had settled into a rhythm of weekly strategy meetings every Tuesday at 10 in the morning. They were no longer tense. He brought data. I brought perspective. Ashley handled marketing initiatives with professionalism, sending detailed reports instead of informal suggestions. The shift in tone was subtle but undeniable. Respect had replaced assumption. One evening, Daniel invited me to dinner at his home. It was the first time since the will reading that the invitation felt uncomplicated. Ashley greeted me at the door with a warmth that did not feel rehearsed. During the meal, conversation moved easily from business updates to the children's school activities and summer plans. At one point, my granddaughter asked me about the lake house, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Can we go fishing there?" she asked. I smiled. "Yes," I answered. "Your great-grandfather would have liked that." Later after the Dishes were cleared. Ashley lingered in the kitchen with me. There was a quiet sincerity in her posture. "I misread you," she admitted softly. "I thought you would not want the responsibility." I considered her words carefully before responding. "Responsibility is not about wanting," I said gently. "It is about honoring what you are trusted with." She nodded, and in that moment, whatever rivalry had once lingered between us dissolved into something more mature. Not friendship perhaps, but mutual understanding. The following week, I made a decision that surprised even myself. I called a special meeting with Daniel and the board. After reviewing the company's improved stability and long-term projections, I proposed establishing a structured succession plan over the next 5 years. Not to relinquish control immediately, but to mentor intentionally. Leadership should never be transferred in secrecy or tension again. It should be prepared, transparent, and earned. Daniel listened without interruption. When I finished, he agreed. The plan would include leadership training, financial oversight milestones, and shared decision authority gradually expanded over time. Control was no longer something to guard defensively. It was something to steward wisely. That evening, I returned to the lake house once more. The sun was setting in long amber streaks across the water. I unfolded my father's letter for what felt like the final time and read the closing lines again. "Do not argue. Do not defend yourself. Simply stand firm." I realized that standing firm does not mean standing alone. It means standing steady long enough for others to recognize the ground beneath their own feet. My father had not only secured my position, he had given me the opportunity to reshape how our family understood strength. As the light faded and the first evening stars appeared above the water, I felt something deeper than vindication or authority. I felt peace. The kind that comes not from winning, but from restoring balance quietly, without spectacle, and without bitterness. Autumn returned to Ohio with a softness that felt almost deliberate, as if the season itself understood the importance of closure. The trees along the factory parking lot turned shades of amber and crimson, and the air carried that familiar crispness that signals both harvest and transition. Nearly a year had passed since the morning my name was absent from one document and secured in another. In that time, Whitmore Tool and Die had not only stabilized but strengthened. Revenue closed the fiscal year up 6%, modest but sustainable. Equipment upgrades were completed without debt strain. Employee retention reached its highest point in over a decade. The succession framework Daniel and I designed was now in motion, with quarterly leadership reviews and shared oversight gradually expanding his authority in structured steps. The difference was not just procedural. It was relational. Daniel no longer approached me as an obstacle to navigate. He approached me as a partner to consult. Our Tuesday meetings evolved into genuine strategy sessions where ideas were examined thoroughly, rather than defended instinctively. Ashley's marketing initiatives began drawing new regional clients, while preserving the company's reputation for precision craftsmanship. She requested my input regularly, not out of obligation but out of respect. The change within our family felt less like a dramatic reconciliation, and more like a steady recalibration. One Sunday afternoon, the entire family gathered at the Maple Ridge house for the first time since everything shifted. The grandchildren ran across the 3-acre lawn, their laughter echoing near the water's edge. Daniel grilled hamburgers near the workshop my father once used, and Ashley set a long wooden table with simple autumn decorations. I stood on the dock for a moment, watching the lake ripple beneath a pale blue sky. The boards felt steady beneath my feet, just as they had when my father first showed them to me decades ago. When we sat down to eat, conversation flowed easily. There were no veiled remarks about ownership or direction. Instead, there were stories about school projects, travel plans, and the upcoming holidays. At one point, Daniel raised a glass of iced tea and cleared his throat. "To Mom," he said simply, "for leading when we needed it." The words were not grand, but they were sincere. I met his eyes across the table and nodded once. Leadership does not require applause. It requires acknowledgement. Later that evening, after the dishes were cleared and the grandchildren had grown tired from playing, I walked back toward the lake alone. The sun dipped low, casting long golden reflections across the water. I thought about the woman I had been the morning of the will reading, sitting quietly while others assumed my absence equaled insignificance. I did not resent her. She had been patient, loyal and steady. But she had also underestimated her own authority. My father had not changed who I was. He had revealed it. The trust, the majority shares, the legal documents, they were instruments. The true inheritance was confidence rooted in preparation and integrity. I no longer carried his letter with me every day. It rested safely in a drawer at home, preserved but no longer needed for reassurance. Its purpose had been fulfilled. As the final light of the day settled across the lake, I understood something with complete clarity. Legacy is not secured by being named first in a document. It is secured by standing firm when overlooked and leading with composure when given the chance. My name may have been missing from one page, but it was written where it mattered most, in the decisions that followed, in the stability restored, and in the quiet respect earned not through force, but through steady resolve.